We're recording.
Okay, cool. Let's get this show on the road. Hi, hello everyone. Thank you for coming. Really do appreciate your participation. Only three of you, but small things, big things grow. Obviously, we had an introduction before, but I'll repeat them again. I'm Russell. I'm one of the members of Basic Income Melbourne. Over there is Josh McGee, who's really much the founder, and we've got Steve McAtee, both of who are going to deliver the talks today for you. Josh is going to be delivering 15 minutes, hopefully, worth of scintillating talk about what is basic income. He's going to introduce it for you. He also plans to talk a little bit about why you should support basic income, I believe, and also he's going to talk at some points about some criticism about basic income and answer to that. Okay. And then we'll have 15 minutes with Steve, who's going to really talk about the history of basic income. Going back into where it started and up to the present day. Okay, so we'll have to give you a good grounding in an idea about what basic income is about. If you need to know more, obviously you could go to our site online, basicincomeaustralia.com, which we have there. I definitely would recommend that because there's lots of other interesting talking points. And by all means, after we've done the talks, we're hoping to schedule some time for you to do the question and answers. That makes it so much better. It's more intimate. You can simply ask any questions about topics that come up today. Okay? Is there anything else to say? So, except hand you over to Josh.
All right.
Again. And
Thank you. All right. So I did. Before I get into talking about basic income, I just want to give a little summary of myself. I did run over a little bit before, but so I'm studying robotics engineering and computer science at Swinburne. And as I study robotics engineering, there's something that I am reminded of constantly in my studies, and it's something that people don't often consider, which is that we live in a completely unprecedented time in history. Obviously, on a social level, a lot has changed recently, but putting that aside and just looking at the technology that we have today compared to 100 years ago, it's mind-boggling to think about how far we've come in such a short time. It's easy to think about the way things are now is the way they've always been, but 100 years ago we didn't have electric computers. That meant no internet, no Wikipedia, no mobile phones, no machine learning, no autonomous manufacturing. Going back 100 years ago, we barely even started manufacturing plastics. It's fun for me as an engineer to have these things, but politically what's important about this is that when technology advances, that opens us up to new ways of thinking about structuring society. By this I mean, having a large-scale society that's operated purely on direct democracy wasn't possible in a world before the internet, because it would take weeks or months to communicate around the world. If you go back just a few hundred years ago when the vast majority of people were farmers, because they had to be, otherwise they would starve, the idea that we would have a society of lifters and leaners maybe made sense, but today, in a world of automation, not so much. Alright, so let's talk about basic income and begin with a definition. There are a few definitions floating around. You've got a universal basic income, a guaranteed basic income, a minimum income guarantee, a universal basic dividend. There are lots of definitions. It gets very messy. At the monthly group that we run, we've workshopped a few definitions. We've workshopped a definition that does a pretty good job of being an umbrella term for all of those. Basic income is an unconditional livable wage for all permanent residents. There are three. There are three important metrics in that sentence. One, unconditionality means that if you can have it taken away from you, then it's not a basic income. Two, livability. This means that if it's not enough to keep you fed and housed with water, electricity, and so on, then it's not a basic income. There are a lot of trials and proposals these days that are proposals of a partial basic income because they're not enough to live on. Three, it must be for every permanent resident. This basically means if you're here just passing by as a tourist, then I'm sorry, you don't qualify. All in all, you're looking at a policy that at its core says that everybody deserves the resources they need to live regardless of whether or not they have a job. This is an outcome of a policy more than it is a policy in and of itself. So why support it? There are lots of reasons, but the most obvious being Centrelink. Given the kind of crowd that we would get at this kind of event, I know that the shortcomings of Centrelink are probably known, but let me just say this. Payments are well below the poverty line, and the percent of homelessness in Australia is increasing. If this is supposed to be a safety net, if Centrelink is supposed to be a safety net, then it's one that's absolutely riddled with holes. This isn't just bad for people who are homeless, it's bad for all of us because there's always that looming threat that we'll be the next one to slip through the net. But then the question is, why not just improve Centrelink? Surely we could raise the New Start payments. The problem is that any system that can be incrementally improved can also be incrementally degraded. So we need a structurally different system. Centrelink was founded on an ideology that needs a complete overhaul. Historically, the guiding light of our politics has been jobs, jobs, jobs. And this means that the role of Centrelink is not to provide a safety net for society, but rather to get people off of Centrelink and into a job. This foundational ideology is how we end up with expensive and irrational workfare programs like Work for the Dollar. We need a new institution that is dedicated at its core to providing a floor beneath everybody's feet through which nobody can fall. The second reason to endorse the basic income is that without it, we live in a society driven by economic coercion. What do I mean by this? I mean that in order for somebody to truly give consent to something, saying no must be a safe option. That is, if you're being mugged and you say yes to handing over your wallet, then you didn't really consent to handing over your wallet. If you say no to, if saying no to sex isn't a safe option, then you didn't really consent to having sex. And if saying no to a job isn't a safe option, then you also can't really consent to having that job. Some people do have that freedom and the ability to consent. But for the same reason that it's important for everybody to give consent in the bedroom, it's also important that everybody has the economic capacity to walk away from unsafe, illegal, unpleasant, unethical working conditions and financial dependencies within abusive relationships. But this isn't just about the freedom from bad things. It's also the freedom to pursue the things that matter the most to you. Suddenly, regardless of what your ambitions are, they become a lot more achievable when you don't have to worry about whether or not it can generate a profit. Spending time with family or friends or getting invested in politics and your community suddenly becomes a lot more achievable when we're not cash-strapped and time-poor. I don't want this to get confused. A basic income is not a silver bullet and does not solve every problem. But what it does do is make every other problem easier to solve when people are freed from their endless treadmills of profit generation. When people have the time and energy to care, they're able to step back from the economic machine that have been contributing to their whole lives and ask what the point of it all is. I've asked a lot of people what they would be doing if they didn't need a job to stay alive, and most people need some time to think about it. It's a big question, and it's one the current system doesn't give us a lot of space to think about. We all get strapped into this economic conveyor belt so early that many people take it for granted. You're supposed to spend your life doing something you don't want to be doing, because that's the way it's always been, right? And if you're not driven by profit, you can do things that have a lot of value to yourself and your community, but that doesn't have an economic price tag. Things like volunteering and helping the environment has a huge social value, but not in a way that can or should be turned into numbers. So let's get into a couple of the common concerns. The first one that people usually have is, how do you pay for it? What I recommend when thinking about this is to take a big step back from the dollar amounts, because money is a human-created abstraction that's intended to represent value in society, but doesn't do a great job at it. If we were to do a quick role play, I could show this to you. If you want to imagine, I'm going to provide you a $100 partial basic income, and I'm going to tax Woolworths to do it. So then you get your money, and you turn around, and you spend all of it buying groceries at Woolworths. At the end of that day, the money is in the same place it was at the beginning. So how much did it really cost? Did it really cost Woolworths $100? It's not a useful description of what just happened. What's happened is that you now have $100 in groceries that you didn't have before. So if a basic income is intended to provide people enough to pay for food, rent, electricity, water, food, housing, electricity, the real question we're asking is whether or not there is enough of this stuff to go around. And the answer to that is unambiguously yes, far more than enough. Depending on which metric you use, Australia is either the second wealthiest or the wealthiest country per person in the world. Another major question that gets asked is, well, what about the dignity of work? And the first thing I like to do here is make a distinction between work and jobs. Work is a surprisingly vague term and essentially boils down to actively doing something. Think of doing the dishes or gardening. A job, on the other hand, is work that you get paid for, like being a dishwasher or a gardener. A basic income, of course, doesn't stop people from either working or having a job. So what is this critique all about? It seems to me that a lot of people are emotionally invested in the idea of jobs being the defining trait of our lives, and they don't like the idea of anything challenging that. But by phrasing it in this way, there's an implication that by having a but that having a paid job is the only way to gain dignity, which is profoundly offensive. It says that children, elderly, and less able people either don't have dignity or have reduced dignity, and I reject that idea. A basic income is a big idea that requires thinking about, rethinking a lot of the things in society that we take for granted. And there's a lot more that I'd like to say, so let me just finish on this note. Everybody deserves an unconditional livable wage, and every human has value regardless of their economic price tag. Thank you.
Josh, okay. Would you like to
Sit down and squeeze in.
Steve, make a tea?
Yeah, I'm Steve, he's Josh. Did I get that the right way? All right, so what I'm going to be talking to you about is a bit on the history of basic income. And this is primarily from basicincome.org or on the BN network. So Basic Income Earth Network. So it's an overview of what they've got. So the first ever idea of basic income was actually from around the 1500s, where a Portuguese traveller was talking to the Archbishop of Canterbury, and he said basically at that point in time there was a lot of theft, and basically the way they dealt with that is they sentenced the thieves to death, which again, as that says, has the side effect of increasing the murder rate, because if you're getting done for stealing a loaf of bread, you may as well kill the person who you're stealing from if they catch you. So what he suggested was we pay people to actually enough so that they can actually have the food. And the benefit of that is that you end up with less hangings. So this situation basically continued and ended up bringing up what happens in Australia, where rather than just hanging people, they just sent them off to other countries. So that's how the US started and Australia. So that was in the 1500s. Australia was settled in 1788. So that idea has persisted for quite a while. So the next one is around the same time, who basically says comes from basically the idea where if rich people can sit around doing nothing, why shouldn't poor people? I mean, we're all sort of supposed to be equal, so why not? There's certainly no inherent reason why that can't happen. So the next one is basic endowment, where again everyone is just getting something. So pay people. The number ended up being an equivalent of about $20,000 in current money. So, and this is the basic idea is it's compensation for what we would not be able to normally get from farming and other sort of practices that would normally be feeding ourselves directly with. So Charles Fourier, again, a similar theme, right to subsistence. So basically you're saying that everyone has a fundamental right to natural commons, hunting, fishing, fruit picking, cattle grazing. So if you don't have access to that as for living in the city, you need to be able to get that kind of money from, again, to be able to pay the people who are doing that work. So it's subsistence based, and you're getting a compensation for the loss of access to natural resources. So those are sort of the two main sort of things. One, to keep people from not having to get arrested or limited by the law, and as access to natural resources. So Joseph Charlier, again, was the first one to actually formally present this as a government proposal. So in Brussels in 1848. So again, we can see that this stuff has been around for a long time. This is, in the range of 200 years. Then Mills, who was also a fairly well-known John Stuart Mill's, a fairly well-known economist, who again suggested a lot of ideas that are close to socialism, that people need, need access to food and resources. So again, he suggested that we have some form of socialism where we can actually get paid for the food that we don't have access to. So again, Russell combined with anarchism and socialism. Again, this was around 1918. So again, right after or during the First World War. And again, at this point in time, there was a lot of trouble getting people back on their feet after wars. So again, this would be a mechanism for keeping people stable after those sort of periods of significant turmoil. So again, central component is to have a payment that is sufficient for necessities. And then we get on a bit further. Again, Major Douglas, another British guy who had the same sort of ideas. So coming out of World War I, the industrialization there. Again, after the war, it was found that everyone was really struggling. So again, he proposed that as a national monthly dividend, or monthly national dividend. And then again, we get into the much more detailed things. Cole and Mead with their social dividend. Again, just after, during World War II and just after. So yeah, again, similar sort of idea, having the access to natural resources should be evenly distributed. So, and then again in the 60s, in the United States, so 3 Americans there talked about, firstly, Robert Theobald, the Ad Hoc Committee and the Trigger Revolution, and another guy called Douglas. It doesn't say who the third person was. But basically, again, here at last, they're actually talking about automation. So, working for pay is becoming obsolete. So, as Josh was saying, so one way to counter that is to have government handouts, or another way to look at it is dividends on that automation. And this one, Tobin's demogram, considered was the first one to look at negative tax schemes. So essentially tax everyone, or tax the rich especially, and then make sure that money gets distributed effectively. And this was actually I think this was the one that Richard Nixon was actually suggested implementing until someone suggested that people would become socialists. So he immediately kicked the idea out. Then you get to the actual first trials in Denmark and the Netherlands in the 70s and towards the 78s. So Denmark did the UI proposal. And there's certainly a lot more discussion there from that stage. So then again we got to Britain and Germany. There were quite a few research organizations, and again, there's a lot more names and dates in here, so I'm not going to go through all of them. But safe to say, a lot of people were actually taking this very seriously and doing a lot of research and a few trials on the UBI and what would happen. So again, showing that the rich are basically getting all the money, and we need to distribute that more effectively. And then the biggest sort of implementation has been Alaska's dividends. So which actually started in 1982, and that's getting on to 40 years of being implemented. So it's typically a fairly small amount. So around about $1,000 per person annually. It has gone up to $2,000 occasionally. But basically what they're doing is distributing oil revenues, again, natural resources being distributed to people. And the things they're finding there is that it actually increases at least part-time employment by about 17%. So during that period. So, and strangely, no one in Alaska's completely dropped out of working, or at least not that we know of from this things. So this list here is a fairly extensive list of all of the trials. These are specifically trials that have actually occurred. So you can see that there's quite a lot, and that's the first page. Here's the second page. And again, they've been trials in a whole different places around the world. I don't know if you can see these on the screen there, but all the way up in the US, in quite a few places. So Alaska, a couple in Canada. We've got Finland and Germany. I think that is in there, and Middle East somewhere. Whoops. India and a few other places, and this is sort of an overview of what the research has sort of discovered. Basically, there's no social stigma from getting a basic income because everybody receives it. So again, rich or poor, you're still getting the money. Primary earners spend more time actually looking for work. New mothers extend the maternity leaves, which means they better care for children. So you end up with better behaved children. Birth weights increase, again, as much due to better access to food as to less stress. So if you know where your rent's coming from, you're not going to stress about it. Funnily enough, that improves health. So students focus on school and grades rather than having to worry about where the money is coming from. In many other places this has been trialled, but in Africa especially, again, we see a significant improvement in lifestyle because, again, people have access to the resources, so they can then focus on living better lives effectively. So hospital rates decline by about 8.5%. Again, less stress in society. Again, less stress means healthier people, which means less work for doctors and nurses to do to try and keep everyone alive. The big one here, crime reduction as much as 42%, and poaching by as much as 95%. So again, a lot of this is from the African trials, but that's incredibly promising. So again, 42% reduction in crime means we would need perhaps half the police force. And considering the difficulties the police have at the moment, that would be a significant improvement for them. Home ownership rates increase slightly, 4 to 6%. At present in Australia, it's about 30% of people own their home and an investment property. About another 30% struggling to pay off mortgages, and the last 31% are simply renting, and basically will never have the chance to own a home. So then the other ones, again, the other big numbers there would be increasing conscientiousness and agreeableness by 43% and 31%. So basically people become nicer because they don't have to struggle as much or compete for resources as much. Savings go up, debts go down, and self-employment and entrepreneurialism increases by a factor of 3, so 300% increase in that. So again, as far as we can tell, there are a lot of very good social reasons why we should actually be doing this. So that's pretty much all I have. So yeah, questions or?